Welcome back to Fantasy Bricks. In this video, I'll be taking an in-depth look at how I created my documentary, LEGO Nerds. My behind the scenes will be split into 4 sections: research, pre-production, production, and post. If you want to skip to a specific section, then you can do so by dragging through the chapters at the bottom of your screen. I'm also going to be explaining the techniques I used and what I've learnt along the way. LEGO Nerds came about when I was tasked with creating a short documentary for my film course. I decided to explore LEGO because I've collected it all my life and even have a LEGO YouTube channel, but despite what it means to me, I've always hidden my passion. Through LEGO Nerds, I wanted to learn to accept myself and stop hiding my hobby. Although, I felt my story wasn't quite enough, so I decided to interview other LEGO Nerds to get their perspective on the themes I was exploring. However, before I could begin planning my film, I wanted to understand documentary theory. I watched countless documentaries of varying lengths and styles covering topics from insects to technology to American politics. The most impactful, however, was a short documentary called AFOL, Adult Fan of LEGO, which was a big inspiration for my film. I also watched countless short documentary tutorials where I picked up an array of useful techniques. I researched Bill Nichols' documentary theory, which states that there are 6 modes of documentary: performative, participatory, reflective, expository, poetic, and observational. I realised that LEGO Nerds will be a performative documentary. The performative mode focuses on the filmmaker's relationship with the subject and often explores truths about politics, history, or in my case, groups of people. Next, I explored the codes and conventions, in other words, the elements that make up a documentary. I decided I wanted to utilise narration, montage, and vox pop interviews. I also explored the legal implications of producing factual productions, where I discovered that consent forms for interviewees were imperative. I concluded my research by digging through old photos and reliving my LEGO story. With my research complete, I could start the pre-production process. I began by writing down my story and devised interview questions that intertwined with my own experiences. Over a couple of weeks, whenever I thought of a good question or another aspect of my story that I could explore, I scribbled it down, and gradually a script emerged. I ordered my questions so I could weave a narrative out of them when cut between my narration. Next, I created an equipment list, which consisted of my Canon M50 with the 15-45mm kit lens, a Manfrotto B3 tripod, a Rode VideoMic Go with a dead cat, and 3 newer 530 RGB lights. After that, I created a shooting schedule. Finally, I printed out consent forms and moved on to the production process. On Friday the 7th of January 2022, true to schedule, I began filming. A sensible place to start was the beginning, so I filmed the introduction before going on to record voiceovers and other pieces to camera. The following day, on the 8th, I interviewed my dad. I filmed my easiest interview first to ease me into the process. I set up 1 key light and 2 lights on my background. It took over an hour to get the lighting right, however the actual interview only took 20 minutes. My lighting setup has really elevated my documentary, and to show the importance of lighting, here's this shot without lighting, and here is the same shot with lighting. In all of my interviews, I brought the subject away from the background to create depth and achieve a shallow depth of field. On the 9th, I filmed my second interview, and by now my setup and interview process was already slicker. However, I learned quite a valuable lesson: record some B-roll first. B-roll is essentially cutaway of the room or a shot that relates to what your subject is discussing. I found that my interviewee was more relaxed as the process went on. If I'd got some B-roll first, then he could have grown more accustomed to the camera and lights and socially settle into talking to me more. True to schedule, I caught the bus into my local city, Leicester, to get Vox Pops, otherwise known as Voice of the People interviews. It was a freezing morning, and I was met by a street of angry-looking people all rushing off to work with much more important things to do than stop for a film student. Despairing a little, I retreated into the warmth of a shopping centre where I began asking people if they would be willing to do a short interview for my documentary. I was met with stony faces, awkward no's, and people simply ignoring me. Then the security guard told me if I didn't have permission to stop customers, then I would have to leave. After politely apologising, I did just that and hit the streets. After asking a few passerbys and getting nowhere, I decided to change tack. I asked 3 charity workers and a busker, and all happily agreed to answer my questions. I noticed that their eyes lit up when I mentioned the word LEGO. Feeling a little happier, I began asking people again, and I'm not sure if it was because it was later in the morning, or because I began mentioning the word Lego, but person after person happily answered my questions. On the 15th, I got my third interview with Richard Carter, who added a different angle as he's the owner of a Lego business. He told me that he'd just moved, so didn't have any built Lego that he could put on display. So, I brought a Lego dragon to make the background more interesting. By now, my footage was very male heavy. However, luckily my final interview on the 16th was with Sam, who could give a female perspective on my questions. Sam's interview was the most interesting, as I didn't realise that female Lego fans got much more stick for being into the traditionally boys' toy. Finally, on the 25th, I filmed my conclusion, where I wrapped up the entire film. I began my post-production process in Adobe Premiere Pro by editing my introduction. Then I watched my interviews through and began splicing them in between my voiceover sections. However, I learnt a valuable lesson here. Edit the audio first before you start cutting it. I needed to add denoise to the clip and adjust the volume. Later on I had to make the adjustments to each clip individually, which wasted precious time. Next, I searched through a sea of B-roll from LEGO events to put over my narrated sections. I began building up a timeline around the footage I had and created a rough cut to show to peers. The feedback I got was invaluable and informed my final film greatly. I split the points into feedback I implemented and feedback I considered but decided against acting on. The most significant point was to get rid of me asking the questions, which made the film flow much more efficiently. The main reason I didn't act on some of the feedback was I felt doing so wouldn't serve the story I wanted to tell. Between the 17th to 25th is where the bulk of my editing took place. I found that there was a lot of background noise in my interviews, which I improved by adding denoise to all. I knew I wanted to upload my documentary to my YouTube channel, which I have aspirations of one day monetizing. If that does ever happen, I want to be able to make money off my documentary. So, this meant I couldn't use music I don't own. However, I worked around this by using the YouTube Creator Library. I spent hours searching for the perfect track and eventually discovered A Fool's Theme by Brian Bolger. It fitted perfectly and added a professional touch to my documentary instantly. However, around the 5-minute mark, my documentary experiences a shift in mood. The interviewees and I talk about the hardships of not fitting in at school and feeling like we needed to hide our love for Lego. To fit this shift in tone, I needed to find a new track, so I headed back to YouTube Studio and began sorting by mood to find something more somber. After about an hour, I found Your Suggestions by Unicorn Heads. Finally, a finishing touch was to add an adjustment layer across my film and make it slightly bluer to give it a more professional shine. And that is how I created Lego Nerds. If you haven't already seen the documentary, then there'll be a card in the top right of your screen now. It will also be the first link in the description. I mainly do build series on fantasy bricks, which track how I build my Lego displays. My current one is called Building Erebor, where I'm recreating the Battle of 5 Armies from The Hobbit. Thanks for watching, please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.